Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you. I feel a slight false pretense. I know the extraordinary work all of you are doing in the area of working with migrants at a very difficult and troubled time in our world. And I'm just very honoured to be here among you and to learn about what you're doing and to say thank you for all your work. I speak as somebody who hasn't worked directly in the area of migration and immigration or much with migrants and refugees, but I come from Ireland, and I come from a country that is marked by, until the first half of my life really, until about the mid-90s, was a country that we used to say exported people. And for the more recent years, we import people. And that's a bit crude as a way of putting it, but it's an interesting reality. And the part of the reality I'd like to begin with is the experience of a people who had been marked by emigration. The culture I grew up in had stories and songs and novels and films about people who had had to leave their homes, people who had suffered. There was a thing called an Irish wake, when a family gathered and said goodbye to somebody who was off perhaps to America, to Australia, and they would never see them again. They were saying goodbye. So they anticipate the wake of death and had this farewell. But these were extraordinary stories of people who then went and suffered because they came as Irish. They came as relatively uneducated very often. Many were speaking an Irish language that the others didn't speak. They were poor, and particularly those who went at the time of the famine were seen as bringing illness with them. So they knew discrimination. And that's an important heritage that we try to keep alive. Our more recent story is the story of people coming into Ireland that's been associated with relative economic prosperity in our country. And that has brought new people in among us. And that has transformed our society. We've gone from 3.5 million people in 1990 to 5.4 million people today. Nowadays, I think it's something like 22% of all the people in the Republic of Ireland were born somewhere else. And this is an extraordinary transformation in what was a very small, homogeneous country. This has been a great learning experience, not without its challenges. Even for our own, the one culture, I'll just take one point as a point of reference, is religion. I grew up in a country that was almost predominantly Catholic. The statistics would say in 1990, 90% of the people were Catholic. Now it's 70%. If you look at those aged 25 to 29, it's 50%. If you look at a more interesting figure, in 1990, there were 2% of people identified as having no religion. Now, among those aged 25 to 29, it's 26%. So you see the challenges that are happening. Our culture is changing, and that's often upsetting for people and makes people anxious. But what I want to do is to try and open a horizon of culture as a horizon of hope. And I've taken a somewhat optimistic title, but I think it's important. It's about treasuring our differences and then building a culture of encounter, which was something that was so dear to the heart of Pope Francis. I'm beginning with an unusual one. As I was preparing this, for some reason I got stuck with the idea of genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is that many species have various forms. In Ireland, we have many varieties of potatoes. In other parts of the world, it's a richness of other fruits. But part of that diversity is, and I just looked this, I asked Gemini to give me a quick hint on it. Genetic diversity is vital for biological conservation because it enhances species' resilience to environmental changes, diseases, and human impacts, ensuring long-term survival and ecosystem stability. Diversity in nature is a good thing. Diversity in culture, then, the word culture often, what do we mean by culture? One of the best definitions that I work with is one that Pope Francis gave us in Fratelli Tutti. And I'll just read it. The word culture points to something deeply embedded within a people, its most cherished convictions and its way of life. A people's culture is more than an abstract idea. It has to do with their desires, their interests, and ultimately the way they live their lives. We all have ways of understanding our world, of thinking our world, of understanding what's normal in family, what's normal in food, what's normal in entertainment. That's our culture. And in that culture, are embedded varieties of ways of understanding the world, of thinking about our world, and that's a richness that our world needs. The other thing I want to say is that culture is not static. Culture changes. I was born into a family with certain values. I moved in and studied law. That gives you another way of seeing the world. I began to study theology, another way of seeing the world. I worked in a university, one way of seeing it. I was put in a parish for a while. We're moving, we're riching, and we're moving between cultures, and that's very important. I think the complexity of cultures is I come from Ireland, where it was very hard for us to acknowledge that St. Patrick came from Britain. Very hard for an Irish person. We took pleasure in, you couldn't say he was English because England hadn't been invented at that time, but it was very hard for us to acknowledge. I also came from one where one of my grandfathers was fighting for Irish independence, while the other was the land agent for a British large holder of territories squeezing out the poor tenantry. Does that make me less Irish? Some people would say yes. But we live also in a world in which we live with multiple cultures. One thing very often we talk about a multicultural society where we recognize the varieties and difference of cultures. Good, but nowadays we look for something which is more about interculturality, to see cultures as mutually enriching, as giving to each other, as contributing to each other. So how do we, one example that it's a very simple, I was walking down a street in New York and they were selling something called mozzarepas. Mozzarepas turned out to be Italian mozzarella added with Colombian flatbreads, and they had come together to a fusion of cultures that, from a cultural and anthropological perspective, were interesting. I don't think my doctor would approve, but they were there. But as I say, the cultural diversity is in different cultures. We have riches and different ways of understanding our world. And Pope Francis was very strong on needing to value and appreciate all the different cultural insights. When he was writing about Laudato Si, about the problems of the environment, about climate change and its impact on people, he was very clear we will need the culture of science. We need politicians and their culture. We need economists. We also need traditional cultures, people who lived close to the earth, and we need to bring those cultures together so that we have the benefits of the insights of all, so that we have a richer understanding of what it is to be human. And the word that's strangely, the most, I've Googled this and made clear I'm right, the most used word in Laudato Si is dialogue. Because what we need is to have conversations between people of different backgrounds, different understandings of the world, so that we have a truly rich and fully alive human understanding of what it is to be on this world. The word dialogue itself, and here I owe a lot to my former boss, Cardinal Ravasi, who was a student of languages. And he always said dialogue came from two words in Greek, dia and logai. I always thought dia meant two. It's not. It means between or across or reaching between two different places. And the logai is the word, the logos, the word. We all have words. We have ways of seeing our world. So a dialogue is ultimately about bringing different views, different understandings of the world, different value sets together, and trying to bring them together to see how we can deepen our understanding of the meeting between different cultures. So again, I'm trusting myself to the scholarship of Cardinal Ravasi. He said the dia word also had to do with digging, going deeper. When we sometimes confront what looked like differences, if we go deep enough, we discover that there are more commonalities there. I remember one thing we worked on, it's a different field, but it's related. It was interreligious dialogue in Ireland. We had a discussion of Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and lots of differences on the surface. We were able to focus on things like prayer, pilgrimage, and fasting to discover practices and ways of being that united us. I'll skip the next one, I'll move on. Dialogue, but dialogue, sometimes we think dialogue is a technique. We learn a strategy. I listen to you and then I get my point in. I make my point better because I've listened to you. No, dialogue is fundamentally an attitude. And it calls for, I think, above all, a different way of looking at seeing, at understanding the person with whom I'm dialoguing. The word that's often used is the word other. It's not a word we like, but very often it's a word that's there. How do we think about the person, the other person? Do we think in terms of proximity? Do we think in terms of somebody who is like me, who is human, who is my brother or sister? Or do I think with the distance of what's different about them? I see them as somehow threatening. I see them as in competition with me. I see them as an enemy. And in our society, it is much easier, unfortunately, to play the card of fear and hate than it is to play the card of love and hope. Our challenge is to be people who face difference, bringing together the aspects of love and hope. In that, and this is where Pope Francis is very clear, the diversity, we bring it together to bring people together, to create a culture of encounter, so we learn from each other. Again, this would be my last quote of the evening, but it's again from Pope Francis. And he said about the stories we need to listen to. And we need to listen to the stories of migrants, because they're always stories of an encounter between individuals and between cultures. For the communities and societies to which they come, migrants bring an opportunity for enrichment and the integral human development of all. When we think of migrants, people who have left their homes, who have journeyed, who have sacrificed, we are talking about people of resilience, people who have journeyed in hope, people of enterprise, people our society needs. And I think one of the stories we need to do much more is to tell the stories of the positive contributions of migrants to our countries. I come from a country where my mother died 4 years ago in a nursing home. 95% of the people working in that nursing home were coming from South India and the Philippines. And they were wonderful people. But I don't value them just because they were wonderful people. But they were people, and we need to understand how much migrants are giving to our society and to tell those stories. To come with it, and for religious communities, because we too, if I look at the reality of my own country, how much we have been enriched by the presence of people who are more committed to their faith than many of my contemporaries who have been through a difficult time in Ireland and for whom the church is something a bit alien and foreign. So much life in our parish is coming from people coming from different societies, and we need to be, as faith communities, tell the positive stories, keep them out there, because there'll be no shortage of the negative stories. And part of that is to create a constituency for positivity. Many politicians are afraid to take more courageous positions on issues of migration because it's too easy to fall foul of their voters who are frightened and afraid. Part of what we need to do is to create a constituency, people who will support those who are courageous, who will stand with those who have a more positive story to tell, and that's part of our job. And as I say, it's all about the stories we tell. Can we change the story? Can we tell the stories about the people who are doing so much good? Can we tell the stories about the young children in our society who are in our educational institutions? We have seen many of our educational, I'm only talking from my own experience, transformed by the presence of children who came from other cultures, who've had to learn another language, but who have raised the levels and become an example for others of what a commitment to achievement and to education looks like. I'll take one point here because I don't want to go on too long. The Archbishop Welby, who's about to retire, our Archbishop of Canterbury, had an expression he uses about, and it comes from the ecumenical sphere, about receptive ecumenism. When I enter into dialogue not to make my point, but to learn what the other person has and that's missing in my tradition. Can we start by often we enter dialogue, well, I listen and then I have my points to get across. No, it's about learning, listening, and discovering. Finally, I just wanted, because the digital has been mentioned, in the digital world, we know that the polarization that has happened is making a lot of these dialogues and these discussions and the reality of migration and refugees much more difficult. What I want to say about that, the first thing I think is important is I'll defend the digital world a moment and say what the digital world the tensions were already there. The tensions were in our society, but what digitalization has done is has allowed more people access to communications means, and therefore those views are out there. So it's become a catalyst of bad things rather than the creator of the bad things. But we need to think of the digital environment as something that ultimately is created, for the moment at least, by human contributions. That's going to change with AI and with the emergence of bots that are not humans, but that will be setting out views there that will look real but won't have a human person behind them. But for the moment, the networks are made up by the interactions of so many people. The Vatican was told many years ago to stay away from the networks, leave them because they're nasty places and there's a lot of violence. But we said, if you do that, you're abandoning the field. What we need to do is think about how individuals and church organizations can be present with an attentiveness to try and bridge the polarization that's already there. Can we tell stories? Can we make a difference? Can we be present? When I was beginning in this area about 15 years ago, they used to talk about user-generated content. But I'd like to think about users generating a culture. Can we enter in with different kind of stories to tell? A couple of people I'm going to just name check. Arlie Hochschild, a sociologist who taught us a lot about listening to the stories people are telling online. Even though those stories may be wrong, they're convinced of the rightness of their stories. The fear that lies in the hearts of people, know where that's coming from, so we can address that. Sherry Turkle, who has this thing about how we need to reclaim conversation, how we need to make a deliberate effort to engage in conversation with those whom we might not naturally meet. And Cass Sunstein, who talks about the danger of a democracy and says all of us need to make the effort to read from people we don't agree with, to go to the websites and the podcasts that we don't like and try and listen and see, can I learn, not learn, but can I at least understand? Can I begin to be more intentional in my engagement, in my consumption of media, so that I'm more attentive to where's my attention going? Am I being caught in an cocoon of my people who agree with me, who keep telling me how great I am and how wrong everybody else is? Or can I make that leap to listen and to try and create a possibility for reaching across? And finally, I just want to mention, coming from the world of culture, three things. One is the importance of the arts. You've been fortunate enough to see the work of sculpture and how the work of sculpture can raise an issue up. But equally, we think about literature, great stories that tell the stories of people in movement, people changing into their societies. I think the short stories of Jhumpa Lahira talking about first-generation children of Indian parents living in the United States, struggling to be at home in the United States while their parents want them to prosper, but at the same time want them to stay completely Indian. How do you bridge that gap? And it's the children very often. I think of in our Irish history, so many of my cousins coming back from England. In England, they were Irish. They come back to Ireland and we saw them as English. And they're somewhat displaced, but there's a richness in that and the stories they tell. I'll recommend very strongly films made by the McDonough brothers. They come with a lot of health language warnings, but they're great stories that tell stories. I think of a poet like Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney, who reflected on the violence in Northern Ireland at a time when there was tribalism there, Protestant Catholic. And he wrote a beautiful poem about the archetype kind of Catholic figure was the hunger striker, linked to IRA. The other side was the policeman who was linked to the British state. And he uses an image. He said, a hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard dumb. The police widow in Wales faints at the funeral home. The suffering was true for both. We need to reach that empathetically where the arts can bring us to understand what is different. And then I want to talk just very quickly, finish on this, 3 images, because I think it's visuals we need. And these are 3 images that I've chosen at random. But this was one at a time when politicians in Europe were warning about the hordes who were invading coming in from Syria. This picture, which showed a poor child who had drowned on a beach in Greece, changed the political discourse. People could no longer speak the same way without the empathy. In other words, the sadness of this turned something that was abstract into a person. We need to give a face. This is what I think Pope Francis going to Lesbos around the same time. People were afraid. It's not so much the Pope that matters, it's the child, it's the women around him, that we see faces that humanize those who we might think are different to ourselves. And the final one is just, I don't know if many of you have ever heard of a program called The Traitors. It's kind of a reality TV thing that is very popular in Europe, less so in the United States. But we had it in Ireland, and they had 24 Irish people on that program, and they deliberately chose to show the Ireland of today. And the great winners, and this is great for Ireland. Here's our winners, and that's what's really wonderful. So thank you.